Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalat wassalam ala rasulillah. My name is Jimmy E. Jones. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Islamic Seminary of America. I'd like to welcome you to another edition of TISA Talks. It's an attempt to let you know what's going on in the inside of the Islamic Seminary of America as we strive to present an education that's both solidly entrenched in our usul, our tradition, but very, very much cognizant and respectful of the context in which we live. As of today, we're having a course that's going on as we speak. We're in the middle of it, called the Foundations of Effective Organizational Leadership, where we're looking back at the history of Islam in terms of organization, development, and leadership principles, and also looking at modern day issues and modern day tools and techniques. And so what we have for you tonight really is a preview of another course that does the same thing, that is looks back at our principles and marries them with the best of modern techniques and ideas and strategies for fundraising. What you see on your screen, actually, we don't have all of that building. Our campus is on the second floor of that building that you're looking at, that we haven't been in for several months, of course, like everybody in Texas, is located in Richardson, Texas. We, aside from having classes there on the second floor, we are about to launch the Center for Ethical and Effective Organizational Leadership, which is a broader strategy to begin to enhance the leadership and organizational capability within the Muslim community. But we have a smaller initiative that, inshallah, is going to be launched in October at, hopefully, at our offices in the building that you see, called the Post-Pandemic Professional and Organizational Leadership Workshop. That's a mouthful, right? The Post-Pandemic Professional and Organizational Leadership Workshops. The aim of those workshops is to find what we call synergistic visionary leaders, synergistic in the sense that people who build both within the Muslim and across other faith traditions to make a better world. Visionary in the sense that they look down the road toward the future, as our beloved Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam, he made dua for us before we were even alive. And they're leaders. We're looking for leaders both at the beginning of their career, in the middle of their career, and older people like myself. And so we're very excited about doing this. We raised money during Ramadan for it. And just join our email list by going to our website, and you'll hear about it. Inshallah, we'll be looking for applications in mid-August. And what we'll be doing is traveling around the country and bringing people and bringing educators together for weekends in order to help rebuild our community in the wake of this serious pandemic. But tonight, we're going to talk about the principles of fundraising. This is one of our TISA talks, and it's an effort, as we said before, to preview a course that's coming up. We always start with Quran because it's our episteme, where we start, and we're trying to be amongst those people who are invited, who arise, as Allah Ta'ala says, the meaning of which, and enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong, and be amongst those who attain felicity. So this flyer might have gotten you here, which was a preview of tonight, and this features our panelists for the night, Faryal Khatri, who is a recent graduate of the IU philanthropy program with a master's, but she's a stewardship specialist at Children's Medical Center Foundation. And she's a former development intern at TISA. She was with us, helping us with the Ramadan campaign. And our beloved Dr. Attorney, Sharik Siddiqui, who's an assistant professor of philanthropic studies and director of the Muslim Philanthropy Initiative at IU, Indiana University. And he's a former board member, former treasurer, and a person who helped us incorporate the original founding organization of the Islamic Seminary Foundation. And so we've known Dr. Sharik for quite some while. And then I am moderating tonight. Our co-sponsors are the Association of Muslim Chaplains, United Muslim Relief, the Center for Muslim Philanthropy, Muslim Endorsement Council of Connecticut, a, a continuous charity, and Rabata. These are all organizations that we work with on an ongoing basis. So what I like to do is, before I talk to our guests, is give you some information about the course, which inshallah will be beginning this fall. And you go to our website, you'll see the exact dates. The instructor is Shark Siddiqui, and you don't need the office hours because everybody's not going to be calling him, hopefully. And this course is designed to familiarize students with the basic principles of effective fundraising strategies and principles in the United States, with particular attention to how these principles are found in Islamic fundamentals and practice. And again, remember, we are firmly established in our faith, but the bonus of this course is that students who take it will get a certificate from IU, and Dr. Shark, he can talk more about that. While they'll be meeting other people outside of Islamic Seminary America and talking to them. And this is one of the things that attracted us about this particular course. More details, the course objectives include identifying the different constituents in fundraising and compare them, design and execute fundraising strategies, evaluate fundraising strategies, differentiate between fundraising principles, and discuss the professional development of fundraising and ethical issues related to the profession. And so again, this will be an opportunity for people to do it within an Islamic context, but get some of the latest. This is the top result. And the greatest in terms of information about fundraising strategies, contemporary information about fundraising strategies. Okay, the course schedule, it starts on September 19th. Some of you who are familiar with us know that our normal, and nothing is normal these days with the pandemic here, but our normal course outline would have students meeting on campus on September 9th and 19th and 20th. That won't be true. We're like many other institutions, we've gone totally online. So all of these classes will be online, but the normal structure is it's a Friday and a Saturday, or a Saturday and Sunday on campus, then 10 weeks of classes, 2 hours, and then another Friday and Saturday at the end. And so September 19th and 20th will be online, of course, and then you see the other sessions. And again, all of this information is at our website, right? This is more the course schedule, takes you through to the end, wrapping up on December 5th and the 6th with the opportunity for people. And this is a very strong thing that we do. We did this in the counseling workshop that we did recently. We're doing a Foundations of Effective Organizational Leadership. We're ending it with a capstone presentation that is the Foundations course, to give the students a chance to apply the principles that they learned early on in the program. So you get both the theories at the graduate level. This is a graduate school, it's not undergraduate, and this is not adult education. This is a graduate school program. But you also get to practice the theory, and you get feedback from your peers, which in the class I was in today, one of the students said one of the most valuable aspects of the way we do things at TISA is that they get feedback and they learn from their peers, because many of the people who come to our classes are well-established people in their field, and they're trying to enhance their skills. But meantime, when we have a lot of interaction, even though we're online, you get a chance to talk to other people and deal with real problems rather than theoretical problems. Okay, so the textbook is Achieving Excellence in Fundraising, right? And there is a workbook that that's provided electronically by Indiana University, Developing Annual Sustainability. It's going to be an exciting, dynamic course. As I said before, you can come away with the Islamic ethical worldview, and plus the best practices of people who deal with fundraising. And this is what Dr. Siddiqui has been about. I got to give you one more advertisement before we go to the program today. Fall academic calendar is we've already started registering for it. And you'll see at the beginning that the academic council that's headed by Dean Yasakadi, we met and discussed, and we decided to put all classes online this semester, with the hope, inshallah, in the spring, that we'll be going back on campus. And so what are we teaching in the fall? Advanced Hadith Sciences and Hadith Commentary with Yasser Qadi and Jonathan Brown. These are two well-known names in the area. We're having Islam in America with Imam Hamza Abdul Malik and attorney Rula Alush, Imam Hamza Abdul Malik. You may remember him as the young imam who read Quran at Muhammad Ali's janazah, and also a very accomplished scholar in his right, and who's building a community in Memphis, Tennessee. And attorney Rula Alush, you may know her as the board chair, the national board chair of the Council of American Islamic Relations. The other two courses are Fiqh al-Muamalat with Rafai Arifin, who's an imam and a lawyer at the same time, because for some of these issues, you need to be both. And like Dr. Shark, he's a trained lawyer, he's a practicing lawyer, he has his own practice, but he's also the imam of a masjid. And Ubaidullah Evans, a very dynamic speaker that many people know. They're going to co-teach the course together. You might notice that a lot of our courses are co-taught simply because we don't believe usually that one person can bring all the perspectives needed. Dr. Shark has informed me that he's going to bring Taib Yunus, for instance, into the course. And so it makes for a much more fuller and more varied aspects of what's going on. So anyway, Imam Rafai and Ubaidullah Evans are going to teach that course together. And then, of course, the course we're talking about today, Principles of Fundraising. And again, we're reminded, abandon people, enjoying the good, forbidding the wrong. That's what we're about at the Islamic Seminary in America. So tonight, what we're going to do is focus on the issue, the principles of fundraising. And I'm looking at my notes here. And the first question, first of all, I should reintroduce I have one more ad, We have a dual hijra campaign that's going on, and you just go to our website. I've done enough commercials for now. You go to our website, you'll find we have a dual hijra campaign that's on Launch Good, and you can donate at our website as well. Okay, so what we have, stop screen share, Ibrahim. What we have are two people who could tell us a lot about principles of fundraising. One is Sister Fariel Khatri, who helped us with a very successful Ramadan campaign, who just graduated from Indiana University and who works in Dallas right now. And also our longstanding supporter of the Islamic Seminary of America, Dr. Attorney Shark Siddiqui. Welcome to TISA Talks family after that very, very long introduction. Thank you both for taking time to come, okay? So let's talk about first, to begin, given your experience in training, what is the biggest mistake that Islamic centers and Muslim nonprofits make when it comes to fundraising? Whoever wants to start.
I'll go ahead and start. Based on my observations and my experiences, I think one of the biggest mistakes is not having a holistic, long-term strategy around fundraising. We've seen, a lot of banquets and sort of these one-off fundraising events, but then there isn't really a continuation in terms of stewardship and engaging donors throughout the year. And so I think that's one big mistake, is not having a holistic and long-term strategy around fundraising.
I call it sort of the storefront approach. I don't want to put anybody down, but I sort of began my work in New Haven half century ago, believe it or not, at a storefront drug education agency. And we had one big event to try to fund our program every year. And it was always a tough go. And if we didn't do well, we were limping into the next year. And so this is a mentality, obviously, we need to get out of. Dr. Siddiqui, what else would you want to add?
Sure. So I think I would agree with both of what Farial and Dr. Jones have said. What I would say is, I think to answer that question, we have to really think about how we got here, right? And far too often, when we're looking at where we are, we don't think about how we got here. And largely, this is the growth of the American Muslim nonprofits, right?
Mm.
If you think about, even though American Muslims have been around in America for a long period of time, but institutional nonprofits or Muslim nonprofits sort of there was a major growth in them at the same time as there was a national growth in nonprofits, which is post 1960, with the Civil Rights Act, and there was legislation that created the 501c3 status. There's this huge influx of Muslim immigrants, and with that, there's this growth of Muslim nonprofit institutions. And so what's interesting is in the 1960s and 70s, when you're trying to build a nonprofit organization, mosque leaders looked around and said, how do, they're professionals, Islam tells us that we need to do everything in an exemplary way. And we looked around and said, our leaders said, let's look at who else does this work in an exemplary way. And we looked at churches and synagogues and other organizations, and saw that they raised money through dance hobs and through fundraising dinners and so on. And in essence, between 1970 and today, we became the best event planners you could imagine, right? But the reality is, and then but what happens is, so that's, it's the professionalization of fundraising with the knowledge of 1970s knowledge of fundraising at the time. But in the late 70s, there's the Filer Commission comes around and they say that this nonprofit thing, this whole sector is a third sector all on its own. And in order for us to better understand how it can work, we need to study it, create research centers and so on. And so the science of philanthropy really, and the science of the nonprofit sector really rises from the 1980s when the Center on Philanthropy at Indiana University is created, the Johnson Center on Philanthropy is created in Grand Valley State, and there's these, Yale creates Pompo, and all these academic institutions start creating. But our snapshot on fundraising was prior to that moment. Okay. And so fundraising over time has grown, as Faryal has said, it's really strategic, it's development-based, it's personalization. But our snapshot of professionalization of how we do fundraising comes prior to that. So when we think about fundraising, even in the courses that I teach publicly for Indiana University, one of the points I make is that if you think about the Seerah of the Prophet, we don't hear of fundraising dinners. We do hear of the Prophet, peace be upon him, asking people to action, right? And in some cases it's individual and sometimes it's group, but it's very strategic, as Faryal pointed out. So I'll stop there, but I think some of the reasons why we are here today is more to when we decided to look at what were best practices and sort of not reflect upon them as strongly.
So why don't I build on your presentation and ask both of you to define some terms for us. You mentioned philanthropy and fundraising, and oftentimes those of us who are not, I'm not very familiar with the field. I used to joke that no one would hire me as a fundraiser when my children, who are very much older now, when they used to bring candy home from the school to sell, I'd just buy the whole box. I wouldn't even sell it, so no one would mistake me. So this is really new to me. On top of it, I didn't know that 501c3s were a fairly new phenomenon. So what's the difference, both of you? What's the difference between philanthropy and fundraising?
Yeah, I think, we have to keep in mind that there's definitions and then there's connotations. And I think, so I'm going to really focus more on the connotations because I'm sure Dr. Sadiq has much more about the academic definitions, but fundraising culturally has sort of become transactional, whereas philanthropy is more transformational. And so sometimes when we think about fundraising, it's kind of like, okay, we're going to raise money for this one campaign or this one project, and then it's done. Whereas philanthropy, it's much more holistic, and it puts the nail into the values, very value-driven, very much transformational. We're not just fundraising, but we're raising money for this cause, which is going to have this impact on these people. And so there's a much broader understanding there. But in terms of technically speaking, I think fundraising and philanthropy are much more aligned, but I think our cultural understanding has become more of philanthropy being something that's more transformational.
Okay, could you break that down a little bit? What's the difference for our people to watch? What's the difference between transformational and transactional on the?
Yeah, so in terms of transactional for fundraising, it might be, kind of going back to that fundraising dinner is, I'm going to give my one donation
Mm,
and then that's sort of it. Whereas philanthropy is more like understanding why you're giving to a certain cause and then coming back and then getting the impact report from that, understanding this is where my money is going towards and this is the impact that it's having. And so you're very much more value driven because you're seeing, this is the change that I want to make in the world. And so I'm going to invest my money towards that. And so it looks more like a investment rather than that sort of transactional, I'm just going to give to this cause.
more long-term in a sense. It has
Right.
notion of sustainability is another buzzword.
Right. Exactly.
Shark, you want to follow up?
Yeah, sure. So to quickly to add to the point, then maybe take it back just because I'm a nerd. So, one example of what Faryal is suggesting is the idea of, do you want to feed someone a fish or do you want to teach them how to feed? And what many scholars have said is that giving someone a fish is charity, whereas teaching them how to fish is philanthropy. So just to go back, the word philanthropy really comes from Greek mythology, right? It comes from from the play Prometheus Bound, where Prometheus steals fire from Zeus, God, and gives it to proto-human. And people always talk about that as such a beautiful story, right? He gives fire to humans. Fire represents technology, science, and hope. He isn't sure that that's going to be successful. He's hopeful that it will. He's taking a risk by giving to them. For all he knew, they would burn themselves up. And so it's this love of mankind. Philanthropy is philanthropos, the love of mankind. What people leave out of that story is what happens when God or Zeus finds out that he stole. First of all, there's this whole idea of stealing fire from God, right? Why wouldn't God want to give it to humanity? But second, the whole point is that when Zeus finds out, he punishes Prometheus by having his liver eaten out for eternity, right? It's a problematic definition. And so later on, you fast forward to the Filer Commission, and Bob Payton, who founded the Center on Philanthropy, one former faculty member of mine, he defines philanthropy as voluntary action for public good. So the only problem from an Islamic point of view of all of this is that from our conception, the idea that somehow this is premised on a myth that, first of all, God would not want to provide this hope to humanity, and second, we would, as humans, have to do it. So I'm working on a book right now called Understanding Muslim Philanthropy, where I actually argue that voluntary action for public good doesn't encompass philanthropy from an Islamic point of view well enough. One of the points I make is that philanthropy, in a very Western dominant definition, requires action. But the reality is, if you were to think about the Islamic definition, which is people asked the Prophet, peace be upon him, how to give charity. He said, give charity. They said, what if I don't have money? He says, do something. If they said, what if we can't do something? He said, if you're about to say or do something that's going to cause harm, don't do it, right? So in Islam, the charity or philanthropy is broader than just giving action. It's also inaction. So imagine what happens if we know that by throwing out waste, right? Or not throwing out waste. Think about the environment and things, what inaction can make the world a better place. And so Allama Iqbal talks about this in his poem called Muhabbat, where he redefines, he says, first of all, Zeus is not God. And if you want a good story, I'll give you one. I'll give it, Prometheus Bound is not the Bible, it's a play. And he says that, and he talks about the alchemist and so on. So just to give you an idea, the reason why I bring this up, I wouldn't bring this up in another setting, because that would be much more about principles and techniques of fundraising. But the reason why I bring it up here is that in an Islamic seminary, when we're thinking about words that are being used in academia, whether it's philanthropy or fundraising or charity, I think it's incumbent on us within the seminary to look at what are the foundations of those meanings and how they may conflict or can be better defined by us as people of faith and people specifically in the Islamic sciences. So, but that all to be said, that if you were to think about the idea of philanthropy is this whole idea of doing good actions with great intentions, right? Good intentions and good action.
Okay.
Whereas fundraising is a transactional activity through which one person gives another person money, and a 501c3 is a form of a nonprofit organization that post 1950s were given tax status. So when you give money to a 501c3 organization, it's tax deductible. So you get to, your cost of giving goes down, whereas a 501c3 itself doesn't have to be taxed. I spoke to way too long, but I apologize. I'm too much of a nerd to sort of, and in this environment, I figured we'd want to hear all of that.
We're here to learn. I'm swinging back to you, Fariel. I mean, yeah. I'm intrigued by this transactional versus transformational, and Shark built
yeah, kind of
be a shift in thinking. Let me add another part of it. So one of the things I'm hearing Shark said is that it's not just money, right? Because think of it as being just money. I'm saying we need money in order to sustain ourselves. But what Shark introduced is the concept of Islamic charity, which clearly goes beyond money. So how do we shift people's thinking about these kinds of things?
Right. I mean, I think we do need a shift from this idea of simply fundraising to philanthropy, because fundraising really is transactional, where you're simply just raising funds, you're just raising money. But philanthropy is much larger. You can be volunteering your time, for example, and that would fit under philanthropy, but not necessarily fundraising.
Yeah.
And so there's that transformational where you're putting in your 3 T's of time, talent, and treasure. And from an Islamic perspective, we see that where, in the Quran, we're taught to work towards social justice. And so that's something that kind of falls into this, is because we're able to give our time and talent in addition to our treasure in order to create a transformational change to society. And you're not just simply you're just not simply putting money towards something in that transactional sense, but it's much more larger. You're creating, you're uplifting society, you're creating a transformational change, and there's a lot of impact. And so there is that basic sustainability aspect of it financially, but then there's much more to that, especially from an Islamic perspective, because you feel like you're, at least, I can speak personally for me, what really attracted me towards the philanthropy school was that it felt like a way that I was able to live out my faith, because that's what I feel like that's what my faith teaches me, is to join in good and forbid evil. And so I feel like this is a way I'm able to do that in different ways, whether it's financially or fundraise or volunteering, or in different ways, in order to create a real transformation in society.
Yeah, I'm sort of stuck here because I'm sort of new to the field, and I wasn't aware how new 501c3s were. They're really a new phenomenon. And with the recent administration, really tax deductible donations don't mean, the lawyer in Shark will tell you, they don't mean as much as they meant 2 years ago. But beyond that, I'm just intrigued with this notion of transaction. I'm stuck there, and transformational. It seems to me that we haven't gotten there yet. I mean, I think when I think philanthropy and fundraising, I think money. I mean, that's what I think. And how do we get there?
Absolutely.
We use the word holistic, but how do we functionally get there to get, particularly the Muslims, to think about it in much broader terms? And in a sense, that would be the term I used earlier, more synergistic, right? The whole is important in some of the parts. It's not only money, but it's other things. And it seems to me that we might be all wrong-headed in the focus of what we do, in terms of fundraising.
Yeah.
You get where I'm coming from?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I totally agree. I don't, we definitely are not there. And I think it's because, Dr. Suzuki had talked about our history earlier. I think we're still in the process right now of developing new best practices. And so I think, classes like this and the Center for Muslim Philanthropy, there's a lot of education that's happening right now. And I think that's a really great first step because they're now understanding philanthropy best practices, but then also with that Islamic perspective that comes in with it. And so that we're able to bring both of those together and be faith-driven in our philanthropy.
Okay.
And so I think we're still very much in our infancy steps right now. And I think in a few years, we'll start seeing much more, being much more closer to that aspiration, I would say.
Okay. I want to remind the people who are watching that near the end, we're going to be taking questions from you. So you can type them to us now and we'll give them to our guests. I want to shift to you, Shark. All right, so this is the big picture, and I'm learning stuff about the history and where the words came from. But if I'm at an Islamic center or a Muslim nonprofit and we don't have a sustainable a development plan, whatever name you want to call it, because it's different than sustainability plan, development plan, where do I start? Given the mindset that Fariel and both of you talked about, where in the world would you start?
Sure. So I think the first point of it is that to actually make the investment and the decision that philanthropy or fundraising or development, as we call it, is something that is going to be a priority within your organization. And I think making that intention and then acting on that intention by saying, yes, my Islamic school, my nonprofit organization, my organization is going to prioritize development or fundraising as a priority, right? And starting there. Having done that, I think the next step is to really develop, as Faryal mentioned, a plan. And there are a number of different ways that you can do that. You can, of course, attend courses like the one that TISA is offering. You can do shorter courses being offered by other places. But in essence, once you've made that intention to do it, you have to think about the management systems you have to put in place in order to make that happen, right? Because fundraising or development or the moment to move from transaction to transformation is to develop what we call a donor-centered paradigm of fundraising. A donor-centered paradigm of fundraising. And to develop a donor-centered paradigm of fundraising, not only do you have to have a strategy, but you have a plan. And that plan has to be undergirded by data. And that's some of the things we'll talk about in this class. What is the kind of data that nonprofits or Islamic centers or Islamic schools can use to sort of develop those programming and ideas and plans? And what are the kinds of strategies that they can put in? So things that we'll talk about in the course, if you don't mind my sort of just giving some small, but we'll look at what is cost to raise a dollar or a return on investment on fundraising. We'll talk about what is a donor pyramid. We're going to talk about gift range charts. If we need to raise $100,000, what is the most economically efficient way of raising money, right? We're going to talk about the development cycle or fundraising cycle. People think about fundraising in terms of one thing. I ask you for money and you give it to me, right?
Yeah.
But the reality is there's 16 steps. And are we doing all of those things? So we're going to walk through what those things are. We're going to look at what are donor retention numbers. We're going to look at donor renewal numbers. And we're going to end with this idea of donor stewardship that Faryal mentioned. One of the interesting things about this, and we know this from our deen, right? We know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that if you don't thank someone for doing something, like to thank God, we have to thank others, right? If someone gives me $1 or $500, $200, what is my responsibility back? So there's research that shows, we now have social psychologists doing research. One of my friends, Patrick Dwyer, just did this, which shows that if you were to send a letter or a thank you email or thank you note to a donor with the intention, with just your only one intention, being gratitude, not with the intention of actually going in and asking them for more money, those thank yous that you send in that are truly grateful are more likely to result in donors giving you money again. So that's one. The other point that we always talk about in the class is we know that if you get someone to give you once, give you a second time, and then give you a third time, but the third time they give you more, they'll give you for 7 to 10 more years. So these are some of the ideas and strategies that we bring together. And Faryal does this in her life every single day, working as a professional in the field. And you know, and she's been part of our classes, she's been part of our trainings. And that's one of the things that we try to, that's why this course is kind of trying to do two things, right? On the one side, we're doing this professional development training that IU provides. It's been providing it for 40 years, called the Fundraising School. I took that class in 1997, right? It's my favorite class. So we'll start with that. We'll go into the techniques and so on. But then we go beyond that, and then we go into the theory. And then we come back to it and we combine the two through applying that theory in our daily lives, right? How can we actually take this? So we understand the theoretical concepts, we understand the professional ideas or techniques, but then we actually understand how to apply them in our roles and in terms of this as graduates, as leaders within the Muslim community. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I want to tell you that I'm stuck at this transactional and transformational thing that Faryal said. And what you said, I think, is all well and good. It just sort of reminds me of what little I know about the psychology of advertising. I think you may know this better than I, that a cousin of Sigmund Freud sort of invented the psychology of advertising, and it's the notion of selling the sizzle instead of the steak, right? I mean, and so isn't it true that if you don't have I hate to say product, but if you don't have a cause that really is transformational, it's more difficult to get, let's swing back to Faryal. Is it more difficult to really do the things that you're talking about?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think you need to believe yourself and what you're fundraising for. And I think that maybe that might be a really great step, is to have that sort of self-reflection as an organization. What are our values? What are our goals? What's our mission? What's our vision statement? Where do we want to go? Because that's really important. Then you have to have full buy-in from your whole staff. That's also super important, as well as board members. Mm-hmm. Because if internally, if you don't believe in what you're raising funds for, it's really obvious. Right. Because you have to have that passion for what it is that you're trying to support. So I think that's, yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a key fundamental step, is to be able to have that self-reflection. And, you know, I think that's important to do on a yearly basis, maybe at the year end, at a year-end board meeting, for example, is to have that sort of strategy meeting, an understanding around, okay, what is the impact that we want to make, and making sure that everyone is on board and passionate about working towards that.
Yeah, see, this is a tough thing for Islamic centers in particular, because I think the way we think, at least the Muslims I know, across cultures and across age groups, from younger to older, that the way we think is that La ilaha illallah is enough, right? That's enough. Oh, Muhammad Rasulullah, I mean, Shahadatain, enough. And that is enough to bind us together and bring us forward. And so when you talk about having retreats or bringing in a consultant, and so why do you need to do this? We know what we're about. We know what we need to do. I mean, I'm just sort of stuck. I mean, I think the techniques and the conceptualization that you're talking about is good. But the question is, I think the nub of it, I think is two parts of it. One is, how do you get, go back to the terms we're using, synergistic visionary, right? Get people to pull people together, the synergy, the different kinds of people together, and to look down the road. I guess off the top of my head, I guess we need to figure out how to pull it from the seerah of our beloved Prophet, Islam, because those people are not going to be convinced unless you bring seerah, hadith, and Quran, right? Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely, I mean, I'm going to yield to Dr. Siddiqui on this one a little bit, but I think it's really hard. And we've had, I'm gonna be very careful how I say this, but you know, we've had board members that have been on the board since the beginning of that Islamic Center. Um, and you know, and may all bless their efforts. This is no way a criticism of them, but you know, times have changed, and sometimes the thinking on those boards have not changed, and that's where we get a lot of friction. And so I think it's, you know, we just kind of need to take a step back and look, okay, what's the best for the organization, whether it's Islamic Center or an organization or whatever the case may be. But it's being able to look, okay, and look and see where we are today, because some of these organizations and these masajid have been around for decades, but they're not necessarily current in terms of best practices, or even in their mission and vision may have changed. And it's okay that mission and vision changes after a few decades. Right. And so I think it's very, you know, that's a very difficult thing, but I think that's something that a starting point that we need to go to is being able to look and see, are we current with the current times?
There's a book that's out of print that was published by IIIT, the International Institute of Islamic Thought. Dr. Shark is very familiar with that institution. It's called the Medinian Society at the Time of the Prophet. I wish they were printed again, so you have some influence there, Shark. Simply because it talks about the transformational nature. See, I'm stuck on that word. It talks about the transformational nature of the hijra. That is, I mean, from an Islamic perspective, the hijra from Mecca to Yathrib changed world history. You with me? It changed world history on a macro level, because out of that small polity, within 30 years after our beloved Islam's death, Islam really was the civilizing influence in the world. That point blank. I mean, whether you believe in what we believe or not, this is just a fact of the matter. My point about this is that what we as Muslims often lose is that our Prophet ﷺ functioned differently in Mecca than he did in Medina. He did not function the same way. In other words, he was one way when he was not in authority, and he was another way when he was in fact in authority at the time, right? Because when he wasn't in authority, he was civically engaged. I know I'm going on a bit myself, because he helped with helping the people who were downtrodden in Mecca. And then when he was in authority, one of the first things he did was make a contract with the people who were not Muslims in that particular place. So he was forward. That's the visionary part. And so I guess our trick is really to both is to try to convince our Muslim brothers and sisters to reclaim that history and that legacy without feeling like somehow, we sort of hadith and Quran focus on the pages without somehow feeling like they're betraying. Because I think the problem for a lot of us is that we think that the Islam that we were born into, whether it was in the United States or overseas, is what the Prophet had. And so I think that's part of the problem. I know I'm editorializing here. What do you think, Shari?
No, I think you're right. I think that we haven't reclaimed our responsibility and our roles. And I'll just give you one example. We always think about the big transformations, right? Mm-hmm. But I think if you think about the power of Islam, I want to think about the research by Dr. Sylviane Diouf on mm-hmm. slaves in America, right? Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is if you think about the Saraka gigs, it's these Muslim slave women mm-hmm. who would collect their daily rations of rice mm-hmm. and collect it together, and at some point mix it with honey and create these rice cakes. Bring all the children from the plantation. They would gather around, and then they would say Ameen, clap 3 times, say Ameen, and then they would eat cakes. Now we think about transformation in terms of the Gates Foundation and so on, but imagine the transformation that that person made with the ability that they had, right? That woman, that Muslim sister who happened to be a slave, felt a responsibility to transform. And within the power that she had, her faith called her to do something, right? So when we think about ourselves today, I think we forget that, right? We forget when people ask me, what's the difference between Muslim philanthropy and secular philanthropy, or religious philanthropy and secular? And what I argue is that religious philanthropy is in partnership with God, right? We're supposed to intend and try to do something, but whether or not it's successful or transformational, we leave up to God, right? And that results in a humility of understanding who we are and what our place is, which goes back to Faryal's point, which is that the question that we should ask ourselves is that if we think that we are the only people that can be in this place and lead this nonprofit organization, do we have that humility of realizing that we're forgetting about that partnership with God, right? Because if it was up to us, or if it was about a man, then the prophet, peace be upon him, would still be alive, right? But there's a humility of knowing our space. And so I would argue that reclaiming that humility that our faith teaches, and reclaiming our idea that we are always in partnership with God when we do our action, and that there's a limitation to what we can do. But at the same time, like the slave women, we have to do the very best that we can do, right? And those come only when, if we abandon our faith, or not abandon our faith, nobody abandons their faith, but if we forget about our faith in turn, thinking that we can come up with a much more professional way, which is outside of the faith, I think we're missing out something. And what I can tell you as a scholar of fundraising and philanthropy, that's what we've learned. What we've learned is that the things that are now considered to be best practices within the secular field of philanthropy or fundraising can find anchors within religious traditions, whether it's Islam, Christianity, or Judaism, or whatever they can be. And I think to your point of reclaiming our knowledge is really important.
Okay. Faryal, how do we keep people from stealing the money? I know that might be on the mind of people. I mean, oftentimes people don't want to give because either they think the people that they're giving it to are either incompetent, corrupt, or both.
No, that's actually a very good question. And I think that the practice that we need to normalize again is being able to ask those tough questions, even whether it's in philanthropy or even learning. Like, if you wanted to go to a class, I think it's absolutely acceptable, and we should normalize what are the credentials of the teacher, who am I learning from? And so I think having, I think we need to normalize being able to ask those tough questions, like, who are you? Who are you as an organization? What's your history? Getting maybe testimonials from other donors. What's your experience? And I don't think we should shy away from that. And I think as organizations should hold themselves accountable and hold themselves to a standard where they can be transparent and when they're approaching donors, that they should be able to have that level of confidence and that level of transparency where, if a donor does question something, that they can respond to that. And I think it's absolutely the donor's right to be able to do so without being shamed. That being said, I mean, I think we should work towards, or even Muslim organizations should work towards getting charity navigator status, getting those types of credentials, and building trust with donors. And then, on a smaller scale, like going back to, where I specialize in stewardship, is being able to build that donor relationship, being able to build the trust of your donor and being able to show the impact, so that way they know that their money is actually going towards what they had intended to donate towards. And if the organization runs into an issue where they can't fulfill a certain program or they have to shift, I think they need to be able to have that conversation with their donors and be transparent. A lot of times I've observed that a lot of times we don't have that transparency in our Islamic centers and Islamic organizations, unfortunately. And I think that's something that we need to start building towards, and as donors, holding organizations accountable.
Shark, you want to add to that?
No, I agree. I think if you think about it, one of the questions that I ask for many of the people that are imams or Islamic leaders, center leaders that come to take my class, and we have this thing called the case for support, which is, why do you exist, right? You know, if I'm going to give you money, why do you exist, right? And on the stewardship side, when someone gives you money, you're supposed to show how the money that was given furthers that idea of why we exist. And the question that I ask is that the case for support for an Islamic center, for example, cannot be that so that we can have a place for 5 times prayer in Jummah, right? The case for support of an Islamic center needs to show what is the impact of coming and praying there? What is the impact of what happens if a child comes or a person comes to that mosque? What does that person become as a result, and how does society, right? So if you think about that idea, which is not transactional, it's more transformational, but then the donor wants to know, did you actually make that happen? And they should have. You know, if we're going out and asking for money, saying that we're going to transform people through the practice by building this Islamic center or this Islamic school, then there should be a way for us to show that's the case. Sadly, what's happening, and there's this theory called the Adizes ladder, right? It's organizational theory. And what happens is that far too often on our nonprofit, and what at some point the institution becomes more important than the cause. And so the institutionalization of the cause requires the bureaucratization of its people. And the reason why and then we create systems, and those systems cost money. So this money that's coming in really goes into the institutionalization and bureaucratization rather than cause building and mission furthering, right? But stewardship, which is a term of art, you know, and people think of stewardship as being thank you. But if you think about it, what does stewardship mean? Stewards are people that are responsible for something. So if you go to a donor and say, I'm going to steward you, the question is, are we saying we're going to control that donor? Are we going to take care of that donor? Are we responsible for that donor? The donor wouldn't like that. The reality is that what the donor wants us to steward is the cause that we have come to them and ask them to sort of, that we're going to do. And so they want us to figure out a way that we can, one, be transparent of what we use their money for. We're transparent about the impact of our organization. And then finally, the donors should have a proper accounting of that. And if we have that level of transparency, as Faryal mentions, I think that we create not just more accountable or more effective organizations, but donors given in larger numbers. Because in this development ladder that we talk about, this relationship between the organization and the donor only grows over time, the stronger the accountability and transparency. There is research, I think Ihsan Begbie has done some work on this, where mosques that actually post their minutes and mosques that post their financial records on their in the Masala raise more money and more consistently than masjids that don't. And they raise it from a broader group of people, right? And that's a form of an accountability, right? And but the more transparent and accountable that we are, research on faith-based organizations shows that you're going to be more effective in raising money and sustaining those relationships.
So we're in the last 10 minutes or so of the program here, and we haven't gotten any questions about fundraising. Got a question about whether or not we're going to go back to the campus once COVID passed, and the answer is inshallah, yes. So I urge those of you who have questions, please get them in now as we are wrapping up. Let's shift once again from both of you. Are there gender and cultural differences in the giving of people in the Muslim community from your experience?
Well, I can talk from my experience. I do feel like as from the female perspective, I do feel like there is more now for female donors. I think there is much more, there's like giving circles, and there's much more independence and much more encouragement for female donors. And, there's a whole center on women philanthropy.
Mhm.
And so I think there's definitely a shift in that perspective, where I think there's much more for female donors. I think, that aspect of it is kind of growing and becoming more normalized, which I think is really great. And then, I think there's definitely, in any corner of society you look at, there's going to be gender differences. That's just, the reality of it. But I think in terms of just in the fundraising world, I think it's more cultural differences, and there aren't necessarily gender differences. They exist as well, but I think there's definitely much more of a cultural mindset. I think that we've sort of talked about already in terms of those strategies that are not necessarily current, that may have come from the 70s, for example. So I think there's definitely those sorts of cultural differences, and that's much more prevalent than necessarily the gender differences.
And the Muslim community is very culturally diverse. So does that call for different strategies for different groups within the community?
Absolutely. So the American Muslim poll by ISBU really talks about some of those differences. But one of the interesting things, if you think about gender in general in America, women will more likely give for deeper qualitative reasoning. So if you're going to go in and show the impact, they want to see more qualitative data, whereas men want to see quantitative data. Men want to say you fed 1,000 people, whereas women want to say, okay, when you fed those people, who are they? How did their lives change, and so on. So if we're approaching women with just numbers, we're not going to be as effective, right? The other thing we know is that women give at higher levels than men do, even in the Muslim community, right? But what's interesting is that Muslim women give at higher levels outside of the Muslim community than they do inside. And the question that I would ask is it perhaps that we're not doing something right? And that's maybe the reason. You'll find similar interesting things about African-American Muslims. Black Muslims give at high rates, but they don't uniformly give at high rates within education institutions. Black Muslims give more to Muslim education institutions than they do outside, but on the other areas, they give outside. And what I would argue is that so much of that has to do about whether or not we have a strategy to engage and include those groups of people. The final piece I'll tell you is, and you should read this report, it's wonderful work by ISBU. Young people young Muslim people are more likely to give influenced by faith and to faith causes than people that are older, right? And so that means 20 years from now, Muslim organizations, provided we don't mess up, will have a whole bunch of people that will give to us. But right now our challenge is Muslims are more likely to give towards domestic poverty relief than any other cause. And they're more likely to give that money outside of the Muslim community compared to inside. So these are important questions that I think we have to think about when we think about these this data.
Okay, so we have one question from the viewers. Can you please speak to the Islamic concept of waqf, that is land or business whose profits go to a charity, in the context of fundraising?
Sure. So we talk about something called a four-legged stool of fundraising. So you have planned giving, you have capital campaigns, you have the annual fund, and you have major gifts. Raising money for a waqf is kind of similar. It's not the exact same thing, but similar to what we would call an endowment in more traditional nonprofits, right? So the 2 points I'll quickly make is that, so the waqf for the endowment comes into the capital campaign. And the way we do capital campaigns in the Muslim community is actually hurting our community. By building, capital campaigns using annual fund techniques, we're actually hurting our concepts. That's one. The second thing is that far too often, the one thing I'll hear from everybody, and I have this cartoon in my class, which I'll show in the first day of class, which, people think that if we can just, if we had this charity, this endowment waqf that was giving us money, we would be okay, and I'm tired of raising money. But the reality is, nonprofits that raise money as compared to nonprofits that depend on endowments, nonprofits that raise money are more innovative, they're more responsive to the community, and they're more engaged with the community. So I've given you a lot, but it walks really fall into the capital campaign or sort of area, but they aren't the silver bullet that we think they are. And so they'll never replace fundraising as a core business of what nonprofits do.
Yeah, and one more from our viewers. We're about to wrap up. Any advice given the COVID environment in terms of fundraising and philanthropy?
Sure. So just one thing to mention is that one big strategy, and I'll let Faryal mention all this because she's been dealing with this. Donor advised funds are a really important resource. And if you do not have on your website a widget that talks about donor advised funds, if you're not telling your donors that you raise money that you accept donor advised funds, and if you're not looking at your data, you should be looking at your data to see who has given money through donor advised funds. Donor advised funds are money where a donor gave money into a pot. So basically put money in a pot, maybe a year ago, 5 years ago, 20 years ago. And when they put the money in this pot, they got a tax deduction. But the money stayed there until the donor can give it out. And what we know is that donor advised funds have given in the past 20% payout rate. So what's happening is right now, when there's economic uncertainty, people have no money, right? Let's say I lost my job. Let's say my income has declined. I'm a doctor, I've declined in income. So maybe I won't give using my current income, right? Because I don't have as much. But the donor advised fund that I have can be only used for one purpose by law. It can only be given away to charity. And what's interesting is the person that heads up Philanthropy for Fidelity, which is the largest foundation in the world today and has the largest group of donor advised funds, is Muslim. His name is Najib Samar. Within the first week of the COVID-19, there was over $1.5 billion given out from just one organization, one donor advised fund out. So there's a tremendous amount of money in donor advised funds, and Muslims just at the high net worth level have that because there's tax advantages, and we should work on those. So donor advised funds is the big one that I would share.
Faryal?
Yeah, absolutely. I would 100% agree with that. And then also engage your donors. Be transparent. If you had to pivot into something, be transparent and let your donors know that this is, because of COVID, we've had to make such and such pivot. And then thank your donors. Do make sure this is a really great stewardship opportunity, is to be able to engage your donors, especially unrestricted donors and live event donors, the last year but not this year donors. You can really engage them and show them, because of your unrestricted donors, we were able to pivot at this critical moment in order to continue to fulfill our mission, for example. And so I think it's all about showing that impact and being transparent with your donors, of letting them know where the funds are being used towards. And so I think this is a really great opportunity to be able to have that engagement. A lot of programming is becoming virtual. So I think it's, if you haven't already, consider bringing some of your programs into a virtual arena. And it's okay to ask, it's okay to let your donors know that you had to use some funds in order to pivot from in-person events or in-person, whatever the case may be, to bring it onto a virtual platform. Because there is a lot that goes on. There's IT, there's, support. So just being transparent and really engaging your donors is what I would suggest.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up. We're going to first go to Sharik, and the question would be for both of you. If there's one piece of advice that you'd give to Muslim organizations or individuals wanted to in your field, I mean, you could choose one or both, what would it be? So that's the final question to both of you. We'll start with Shark and then we're going to Fariel, and then we're going to swing back to you, Shark, for closing dua.
I think that make the intention of wanting to make this pivot from transaction to transformation, and then create a plan for that.
Okay. Fariel?
I think my piece of advice would be to look at the development cycle, and so that we don't get stuck on that one step where you're simply constantly asking, but you're fulfilling the whole, you're going through the whole development cycle. And that would be my parting words.
Okay. So thank you both very much, and reminding you that this is a preview to a course that Professor Shark is teaching in September. You can go to our website for more information about that. Our next TISA talks, we're tentatively set for August the 20th, and we have a surprise for you. We're doing a joint program with another institution, which will be a bit of a game changer for some of the things that we're doing. So we encourage you to join us. We'll have some principles from that. In the meantime, stay safe, wash your hands, social distance, and sorry, Texas folks, I'm not coming down there as long as things are like they are, you know. Shark, closing dua, please.
Sure. And thank you so much for having us here today. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وعليكم السلام.
Bye.